of conversations that are seeking to explore the impact across our communities of events that have occurred over the last few months, both globally and locally. By way of an introduction, I'm Wes Shelbourne, CEO of Just Lincolnshire, and we're really pleased to be working in partnership with Voluntary Centre Services in facilitating this first conversation and exploring the impact of recent events on the third sector. Indeed, who would have thought that at the beginning of 2020, that by August, we would have been in the centre of a global pandemic, been living through lockdown, seen the fault lines of inequalities develop and widen, and see worldwide demonstrations as a result of the murder of George Floyd. And as the news shows us this week, others also. To help us unpack and navigate our way through some of these issues, particularly from a third sector perspective, we have a varied and distinguished panel. I'd like to introduce Iggy Patel, founder of Halo AbleTech and many years of experience in equality and inclusion and consumer law. Caroline Kalevi, who joined YMCA Lincolnshire as Chief Executive in 2018, and Lizzie Jordan, founder and Chief Executive of Think to Speak, a thriving social enterprise in the county. And hopefully joining us in a short while will be Sydney McFarlane, MBE, who is involved with many local voluntary organisations, including the University of Lincoln Court and trustee of International Bomber Command Centre. So welcome and good morning to all the panel. Just before I go any further, could I just remind all the attendees, i.e. non-panel members, to turn their video off and to mute their microphones, please. Thank you. So before we look at some of the more specific questions, I'd like to read a quote and ask for the panel's reflections and thoughts on this. The quote is from Darren Henley, the Chief Exec of the Arts Council. He says, "Black Lives Matter. Until this is shown to be true through actions as well as words, we cannot claim to be a society that values all lives equally." I'd like the panel just to give their thoughts and reflections on this quote before we go into some more specific questions. So, Iggy, could we start with you, please?
Yeah, hi everyone. That's a very good quote, particularly in line with particular things happening in the arts industry and certain places closing down today, or that we've heard in the news. It is really important that things are allowed to happen rather than just voices, to ensure that everyone has the opportunities that are available through life, whether they be inclusive opportunities, equal opportunities, etc. And we can often get bogged down with the terminology and politicizing the issues, but when it comes down to it, for me, it's all about humanity. We all live together on one planet, and we should be supporting each other regardless of our culture, color, race, religion, etc., to make the world that we live in a much better place for each other. And I think that's something we can do together as a unit rather than as individual groups of people. And I think that's really, really important to stress from my point of view.
Thanks, Iggy. Lizzie, would you like to comment?
Wes, I'm not sure we've got Lizzie just yet. And there's a request in the chat if you could turn your video on, Wes, so that we can see you.
I'm happy to. My camera is on according to this.
Oh, okay, it might just be the capacity of the meeting. I think we have got Caroline on the phone though, if you want to go to Caroline.
Yes, yeah, Caroline, could I ask for your comments on that, please?
Yes, of course. Morning, everybody. So I completely agree. I think recent events have really started to challenge all of us, and this is why we're having this courageous conversation, really. And it's important that we have those conversations with ourselves as well, and starting to have a little bit of a think about whether we've done enough, whether we've done anything, and this idea of moving into action and not observation. I think he's absolutely right. He's bang on. And what I would say is action, though, can be also at micro level and a macro level. It has to be on an individual basis, and we need to be taking action, challenging, reflecting, learning together, but also then we actually need to stick our head above the parapet and where we can influence those macro decisions. And I completely agree with Iggy. I think that this idea that we've got to collectively do this. This is everyone. This is humanity's challenge, and we've got to do it hand in hand.
Great, thank you for that, Caroline, and hello, Sydney. Welcome to the meeting. I'm hoping that Sydney and Lizzie will be able to hear me in a moment. Hi, Lizzie, can you hear me?
Hi, Wes. Yes, I can.
Hi, Lizzie. I just, you may not have heard it. I read out a quote, and the quote is this: that Black Lives Matter. Until this is shown to be true through actions as well as words, we cannot claim to be a society that values all lives equally. Iggy and Caroline have just given their reflections on that quote. Would you like to comment?
I think it's indisputable. It's we are in very dark times right now, and I think a lot of progress has been made, but we have such a long way to go that we until we get to the point where everybody recognises why that statement is true and fact, we've not got to the point where everyone where we've actually reached equality.
I think that's an excellent point. Sydney, are you able to hear me? I don't think Sydney is still able to hear me, so we'll continue on until we get that rectified. Then I'll come back to Sydney for comment. Really, just following on from that quote, one of the comments we often hear is that, yes, okay, maybe there are issues we need to take on board that have been highlighted through Black Lives Matter, but surely it's all lives that matter, not just Black lives. I think that's a comment that has been frequently promoted. Caroline, would you have any comments on that?
Yes, I would, and I think clearly all lives matter. I think it almost goes without saying that all lives matter. But the point here is that actually Black people are being targeted in our society, and they're actually experiencing discrimination and disadvantage in a way that white people don't. And I think when we're having this debate, and that's on the table, and we're starting to think about why that is and what we can put in place to stop that happening. And we're all having these really soul-searching conversations with ourselves about whether we can do more. And believe me, I suspect all of us have had those soul-searching conversations with ourselves. It's a distraction then to move back out into this agenda of everyone. Because actually what's on the table, what's up for debate, is how actually we can stop this level of discrimination and this level of targeting to our Black communities. So I don't think anyone would debate that actually all lives matter. Of course they do, but in reality, Black people are more susceptible to stop and search. They're more susceptible to actually having their decisions challenged, to not being trusted in shops. In America, what we're seeing now is they're much more. The statistics show that they're much more kind of susceptible to shootings, police stop and search, all of that. That's the reality, and that's what we're debating. So I do think that actually it's a distraction, and I think we shouldn't, as a community, holistic community, be defensive in having these conversations. We shouldn't jump to almost distracting angles of let's debate whether all lives matter. Well, it's not up for debate, is it? We all say they are. But in reality, what we're talking here is how we treat our members of the Black community here. So I think there is this almost denial that white privilege, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk about that white privilege exists, and a hesitation to really start to address some of these issues, because we're all feeling slightly uncomfortable, we're all feeling slightly defensive, but to jump to an all lives matter position, I don't feel helps.
Okay, thank you for that, Caroline. Sydney, are you able to hear me? Right, Sydney. No, I think Heather, we're still struggling in terms of communicating with Sydney, who I can see but he can't hear.
Yes.
Iggy, would you like to comment on the All Lives Matter question?
Yeah, I've seen lots of these posts, and it's quite disheartening that from where I see it, it seems to be almost a comeback to say that they feel people who are putting these things up feel that somehow that they're less important. That's not the issue here. All lives do matter. All equalities matter. And I mean, I'm disabled. I have disabilities, and the effects of disabilities and how people, that relates to society is of the utmost importance to me, as well as race. However, at this particular time, we have been highlighting Black Lives Matter because it's a particular issue that's been missed time and time again. And yes, historically we have had marches, we've had famous people speaking out, etc. We've had even people's lives lost. But how is things changing? Is it changing? One of the things that's really important for me is that it's easy to sort of carry on and work towards everything new that comes up, and that's the next big thing, and then that's the next buzzword. But it's until you've actually made an impact and actually can show change and effect. When we come to Black Lives Matter, though lives is the important bit, but don't remember it's not just about their actual lives. It's about the opportunities they have as well, employment opportunities, and opportunities in life that go with Black Lives Matter. Just as important, the housing, the poverty, all these things are issues to also consider within that Black Lives Matter sort of slogan. However, the importance is at this particular point. Next year it might be disabilities. Next following year it might be LGBT. But right at this point, because of the deaths and the support of the communities, there are a particular group of people in our societies who are saying, "Hey, listen to us. You know, we're not being treated fairly, and as humans, we have a duty to listen to that. We have a duty to say, hold on, what are we doing wrong here? Have we missed something? How can we improve this? How can we make things better?" And I think that's where we're at. It's not enough to be shouting, but we're looking at actually positive steps that we can take, both locally, individually as well, to actually say, how can we improve this? And a lot of this stuff, I mean, I had a discussion with my daughter only a couple of days ago, who has developed her knowledge greatly on this particular issue. And she was clarifying and educating me And that's important to make sure, just because we are people who may even work in these type of industries, that we all need to be educated and continuously educated, continuously remember these issues are ongoing, and to actually work towards solving a problem.
Thanks, Iggy. There lots of really good points, I think, that hopefully we'll unpack a little later as well. There's a couple of things I'd like to come back to. Lizzie, have you got anything you'd like to add to that? Well, I think you just need to unmute.
You're on mute.
Hello.
Hello.
Oh my gosh, technology is not our friend today. Yeah, I just wanted to share a tweet that I saw back in June, and I'll just read it and then add a little something. And the tweet says, "If you truly believe that all lives matter, then you should have no problem saying that Black lives matter. Think how weird would it be if I or you repeatedly said, I like all vegetables, but then I refuse to say that I like carrots. And then I get really pissed off when someone says that you like carrots." And actually, the point in that is, if by being a carrot, for example, just being a carrot and your daily life, your experiences, your opportunity, does being a carrot make your life harder or not? And actually, I think that's what's really important, is that a lot of the people who shout and shout about all lives matter have not necessarily done the work around recognizing their own privilege that they have simply for being born in the circumstances that they were. And that's really the crux of the start of this conversation, of recognizing the privileges that we have, and acknowledging those, because they are not barriers from the second you enter this world. And I think that's the piece of work often that people haven't done when they go straight to all lives matter. Because yes, all lives do matter, but your life as it is and as it exists is not to the detriment of a characteristic that you cannot change.
I think that's a very powerful tweet and a powerful message. And just before I go on to sort of a follow up from that, I just want to ask Sydney if he can hear us yet. And I would say that that's a no, which is a shame, because Sydney's contribution is vital as well to this conversation, but we'll keep working on that. Lizzie, you mentioned a term there, white privilege, and we've had a question that has come in. Is the term white privilege helpful or divisive? Just coming back to you, Lizzie, could you just unpack that a little bit, please?
I think a lot of people are totally unaware of actually what do we mean by privilege. You know, taking the white out of it, what do we mean by privilege? And actually unpacking that word is as vitally important. And then we put race in a context of privilege. So I am wholly aware, and have been for many years, but that involved a lot of conversations, and some of those very challenging, around the privileges that I hold. And they are many, you know, and I have to really be very conscious of that, and the privilege that we hold. Those privileges don't necessarily mean that therefore you are not going to struggle, you're not going to suffer, etc., etc. But what it does mean is those inherent parts of your identity are not to the detriment of your life, of your opportunity, of your experiences. And I think a lot of people misunderstand the word privilege as in it's related to financial security or kudos or privilege in a very kind of class-based system almost. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily consider the privilege that is their innate being, and that's not in education. That, you know, a lot of our work is with children and young people, And we see that in education, the term privilege and the work around unpacking that word isn't necessarily done. And that for me is something that has to change, and I think we're starting to see that change. My cat's joining us.
Oh, very nice. Oh, thank you for that, Lizzie. Sydney, are you able to hear us yet? No. Iggy, could you just expand a little on the idea of is white privilege helpful or divisive as a notion?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think Lizzie's talked quite. Our answers are absolutely brilliant. I completely agree with that. There's a lot when we talk about privilege that we take for granted, particularly by adding the race element to it, wherever we are. When it comes to privilege, I mean, I don't know how many people have actually looked at a seminal study carried out by a teacher. Her name completely passes by me, but blue eyes, brown eyes, and just how teach, treating a person by the color of their eyes has an effect, not just physically, but socially, but emotionally as well, on a person, and how it affects how they interact with society and everybody else around them. And I think that that's really important to actually get the idea of what do we mean by privilege. And I think that's the key word, as Lizzie has pointed out, that privilege is a lot of it is, I mean, I'm still learning myself about the privileges I have in society that we live in compared to people in different countries who may not have those. But when it comes to white privilege, yes, I mean, even things like when you think about if you're in employment and you apply for a job with a foreign African Arab or Arabian or Asian sounding name, you're less likely to be actually given an opportunity to actually get that job because you won't get the system. And these are maybe subconscious, some of these. But I think, again, we need to look at challenging and educating ourselves. And the question is always, bring it back to ourselves, put ourselves in other people's shoes, to be able to understand what it's like. And until we do that, until we keep saying it's them and it's us, then we're not going to get it. We have to walk, we have to see things through other people's eyes, other people's feelings, to actually truly get an example of what it's like and the effect it can have socially, economically, psychologically, mentally, on a person. It's not just about color. There is so many different aspects that it can affect.
Thanks for that, Iggy. And do you think, and I'll put this to you, Caroline, that in terms of what we've just been discussing there and the narrative around the discussion, that the media have a significant responsibility in how this is presented to the public in general?
Yeah, I do. I think absolutely. I think it's human nature to always think there are two very clear, distinct sides of every story, and I do think that the media are sometimes oversimplifying the world events and suggesting that there's kind of almost a black position and a white position, and actually I thought that's hugely unhelpful. Excuse me, hugely unhelpful, because it kind of suggests that the words white privilege are a personal insult. And actually, as soon as people start to think that actually they're being insulted or being accused of racism, they get quite defensive. And I think that's the issue. Is the words white privilege have been misunderstood and misinterpreted by the media, and actually misunderstood from all parts of community, actually, because these words aren't a personal insult. It doesn't accuse everyone of racism. It isn't. There's not an inbuilt assumption there that the achievements of white people have been unearned in some way, but it does talk about the built-in advantage of being white. the fact that actually we all, on a daily basis, if you're white, you can probably assume that you're going to get the benefit of the doubt. And in reality, some black people cannot assume that. So you know, when I pay with my credit card and it gets kind of, you know, knocked back for whatever reason, well, I'm not standing there and I'm thinking, oh my goodness me, they're looking at me because I'm a white person and thinking all sorts of things now. I'm thinking, oh, we've got to sort this out. It's an admin issue. Let's sort this out with the bank. But if a black person was stood there, then they cannot guarantee they're going to be given the same benefit of the doubt that the rest of us get. So I do think that media has some part to play in this, but I think it's also about our individual responsibility to unpack these words and really properly understand what they mean. And if you don't know what they mean, then go and find out what they mean, and don't get defensive when there are words used. You actually kind of reflect back and try to unpack what that actually means. I do think Black Lives Matter has kind of lifted this invisibility cloak on white privilege, and I think a lot of people have not really thought about the unseen and the unconscious advantage that they get in society until now.
Thanks, Caroline. Absolutely, and that is part of the reason why we're looking to run this series of conversations. I think to shine a light on some of these issues. Sydney, are you able to hear me yet? No, I think we've still got problems with Sydney and the communication side of things there. One thing I'd like to put to you all as a panel, and we'll probably kick off with you, Iggy, on this. Lincolnshire can be seen as, it does have a lot of unique features as a county, and it's a great place to live, work and visit. I've heard several comments and views expressed over the past few months that actually what we're talking about here, yes, it's an issue in America, yes, it's an issue in other parts of Britain and other cities, but somehow Lincolnshire's different, and really this is an issue that doesn't apply to Lincolnshire in the same way as other places. What would be your thoughts on that, Iggy?
I think Lincolnshire is quite unique, historically speaking. If we look at migration, which obviously plays a big part, generally migration and the minority communities, whether they be Asian, Black, people of color, have all moved to areas where generally they've been industrialized. And in those areas, they've been welcomed by the industrial communities as cheap workforce. Similarly to what I would say probably in certain areas of Lincolnshire as well, with the Eastern European communities. And in those areas you have, because of that gathering of people, you have, because of those communities are changing, the issues start to develop. This is something I've learned from speaking to my father and from experience. And it was very much sort of when we first came here, the factories, the industries fell over themselves to actually welcome us, to give us these jobs, because the local communities didn't want to do it. However, the societies that they moved into weren't so welcoming. And I think that's partly a problem with politics, in that we just didn't prepare for the integration of these communities, knowing that we need them. And it's something that I constantly fight for even now, is getting the local authorities, getting the local organizations to actually say, open your doors, find out what their issues are, what your needs are, and integrate them. This is a subject area which is very, very dear to me. Because of that lack of community cohesion that occurred, those areas, people from the Asian communities and the Black communities congregated together for their own needs, so that they could have their own food supplies, they could have their own communities, because there just wasn't those communities. And because of that, you had then certain areas that particularly built up. Because Lincoln itself, and Lincolnshire has been very rural, up till quite recently, it's never had that issue. The communities of people that have moved in have been professionals, doctors, etc. And these professionals have integrated into the local communities. So therefore, you don't see it as a particular issue in Lincolnshire, particularly in relation to probably the Black or traditional ethnic minorities that we would see. But there is a similar thing happening in Lincoln, particularly probably around the Eastern European communities. And again, it's just something we've missed over and over again. We've just not learned from the past. And we want these people here because of the industry and to do the work, but then we don't support them to be integrated into our societies. We don't do anything for them. Even now with certain illnesses, for instance, COVID, etc., where some of the areas that are suffering, particularly Asian areas, etc., where are the translations about hygiene in the local languages, in Gujarati and Urdu? I've not seen any, and I've researched this quite a lot. Yes, there are for some of the more traditional ones, but for the general Asian population, possibly for the Chinese population, and other people of non-English speaking, where is this? And then we blame them for saying these are problem areas. I think it's not a problem. Yes, it hasn't been. The student population has made a big difference, and that will, again, what I always think is integration is always a bonus. It's a gift. It's something that we can all benefit from. It can bring us so much more. I mean, think about when, even in historically, why did the British go out to these countries? They wanted the silks, they wanted the spices, they wanted the materials. So that's all we're bringing back to these societies. It's got to be a benefit. And I think in the long term, we need to look at strategies, not just the government, but everybody needs to look at strategies of how we actually invite people into our communities and how we make them feel safe, how we integrate them so that they can learn to speak our language, but also we celebrate theirs as well. So it's actually a two-way street that benefits everyone.
Absolutely, Iggy. You made some really valid points there, and I'm conscious that quite often, and particularly in sort of community and volunteer sectors, we can be quite guilty of talking about particular communities and putting communities in boxes. We can talk about the Eastern European community, the Black community, the LGBT community, actually, rather than viewing actually everyone as an individual, integral part of the whole community. So I think you make a very good point there. Sydney, are you able to hear us yet?
We're still working on Sydney, but Lizzie's got her hand up, Wes.
Okay, yeah, Lizzie.
Yeah, so two things. So from what you've just said, Wes, actually, we have to be very conscious of talking about intersectionality. And, when we are, and I know the third sector, we are very good at, defining boxes because they often tick somebody else's boxes. Mm-hmm. But actually that people have so very many facets of their identities and their capacities, abilities, opportunities and experiences. And we have to remember that those intersections happen, but also the additional kind of minority stress that's placed upon individuals when we have lots of facets to our identities. But the thing that I wanted to say was about when we're talking about here in Lincolnshire, so our family, my son is mixed race, and we have seen the good, the bad and the ugly of racism in Lincolnshire, and some of that has been microaggressions, some of it has been far more macro, and some of it has been systemic. And I think we really have to acknowledge the fact that systemic racism is an issue, and it is an issue here in Lincolnshire. And we often find that with the identifying and ticking boxes, that it comes down to a numbers game. And we've had experiences, negative experiences with the police, where my son, age 12, was stopped and searched for walking down the street. And when I questioned it, I was told, well, were they stopped because of the colour of their skin? And the police officer said, well, no, because we don't actually stop many brown people. And I was like, wow, okay. So there's a whole discussion there around what does systemic racism actually look like? What are people's perceptions? But then equally, when you're looking at a numbers game, which is what often people do here in Lincolnshire, they think that the population of voices of colour is so small that we don't need to do anything differently, or this isn't an issue, or we don't need to do things differently. And actually it totally silences the voices that we need to be hearing. And today's an ironic example of that, I hate to say, but actually how do we amplify voices, and how do we enable and activate their voices? Because we often find that because we're talking about minorities, how do we, and I'm speaking here with my huge bag of privilege, how do we amplify the voices of minorities? How can we activate them? How can we enable them? How can we support them? And how can we move aside so that actually their stories are heard, their voices are heard, and their experiences are respected or listened to and actually validated? Because what we often see is that their voices are not heard. They're not invited to the conversation, or if they are, it's in a tokenistic way. And that has to change here in Lincolnshire. We have to address the ways that we go about things and our gut reactions to things, and doing things differently.
Absolutely. Sydney, are you able to hear us now?
I can hear you now. I'm on my mobile.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're struggling to hear you, or I'm struggling to hear you. Are you on mute at all? And I'll come back to you in a couple of minutes. I'll just on the back of what you were saying, Lizzie. There was a quote that I saw today that came out of the inquiry into the Windrush scandal, and it talked about what was found within government departments, particularly the Home Office, during the scandal. And it talks about a culture of disbelief and casualness and institutional ignorance, thoughtlessness towards the issue of race. And, you know, I think maybe that's a whole different conversation that would take up an hour in itself. But I think there's something in those phrases that actually sums up a lot of not necessarily intentional, but institutional and embedded ways of thinking and working, particularly around issues of race. Caroline, have you got some comments you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think in terms of I arrived in Lincolnshire about 20 years ago or so, and still, interestingly, even in third sector circles, networking, the first question that people want to know in Lincolnshire is are you from Lincolnshire? That so it's an interesting thing, isn't it? You kind of I'll never be a yellow belly because I clearly have arrived from somewhere else, and I think in Lincolnshire, I genuinely think we are probably, let's say 40, 50 years behind some of the main cities in terms of how we understand, accept, and embrace difference. And I think that's fundamentally what it is we only know what we know. And you know, all education, learning kind of theory will say that you learn when you're actually doing it, it's lived experience. So what we need to do is we need to find across Lincolnshire, find ways where we can start to talk about difference and start to talk about kind of different cultures and different kind of, kind of challenges that individuals are experiencing, so that people can live it and understand it. Because if you're out in rural, and genuinely you just have mixed for the last 20, 30 years with friends of your family who are all from the same community, and very little interaction with other kind of cultures or religions, this kind of experience that actually you then can say, okay, so now I embrace difference, and this is how I welcome, and this is how I'm compassionate and understand. So I do think it's a particular issue in Lincolnshire. And what I'm not saying there is that everyone in Lincolnshire doesn't understand the world. But I think collectively, particularly in the third sector, we've got to help our communities that we serve understand difference and embrace it, and actually start to be interested in it, and be actually it can enhance our community, rather than something to be feared.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm just conscious of a couple of things. One is time. And obviously we did start a lot later than originally planned, just due to those technical issues. The second is, I know there's a few of you with comments and questions. I think, to be honest, with time against us, it's going to be difficult to address those all here and now. But I would certainly plan that we will take these comments and questions that are coming up and respond after this event in a way that people are able to see the questions and the comments and thoughts on it. So I hope that's okay. Sydney, are you able to hear us, and are we able to hear you?
I can hear you now.
Oh, and we can hear you loud and clear. That's great. Welcome. I'm sorry for the technical issues.
That's all right. This is now on my iPhone.
No, we've been obviously covering quite a lot of specific issues, but I wondered if you could just take a few minutes, Sydney, just to bring your perspective to the conversation of the idea of white privilege, and really what we as a county and as representatives of third sector organisations need to take from that.
Is this related to the first question, panel question?
That's right.
Okay.
Sorry, we're struggling to hear you again, Sydney.
I think Sydney's on two devices, and one's muted and one isn't, and they need to be the other way around.
So you may just need to unmute something, Sydney. No, sadly, Sydney.
And then unmute the other one.
Any better?
That's great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, Sydney. That question of white privilege, and really what we need to take from that as a county and as voluntary and community organisations as well.
I think white privilege, to me, it's simply the fact that obviously the majority of the population is white. I mean, you could have black privilege as well in certain circumstances. I used to think just a privileged background is probably a better way of putting it. Someone who was brought up, whose parents have never had to sort of strive for anything, and life's been fairly comfortable. And that could apply. I know it's apply. The indigenous population are white, so we tend to say white privilege. But you can have, especially in the current situation where you have third and fourth generations going to university and in good jobs. They're not in the majority, but so I don't particularly go for the term. I just rather prefer to say you are from a privileged background as opposed to white privilege.
Yeah. Okay. And Sydney, from your perspective, how does that notion of privileged background play out in terms of if you are black or if you're from a black and minority ethnic background in sort of a day-to-day lived experience?
Well, it's funny enough. It got the opposite effect really, because you're assumed to be it's rather like going for a job. You're assumed to be not privileged because you're black and therefore you cannot be in certain position. Like for example, if I just digress now to the stop and search, for example, where it's assumed that if you're driving a BMW car as a black guy, it's got to be drug related or something. You cannot have earned that sort of legally. That's sort of unconscious,
Yes.
but you know what I mean.
Yes.
And so you're not expected to be privileged, which can be worked in the wrong way that is meant to work. I've been sort of caught into that trap really on a couple of occasions in the Air Force and out of the Air Force.
Right.
And that confusion caused by my name actually, because with a name like McFarlane, I'm deemed to be either, until you see me, in other words, a visible minority, I'm deemed to be either Scottish heritage or Irish heritage. And I've had to explain to people that it all emanates from slave trade and the abolishment of slaves, when instead of being given a number, you were given the name of your previous slave owners.
Yeah.
And that has stand me in good stead and in bad stead. So on one occasion, I was posted to Cyprus in the Air Force. And in those days, you were given a sponsor to the section you're posted into. And they sort of, whoever it is, will look around for accommodation, because you had to go into private accommodation whilst you wait for married quarters to come up. And this chap, Scotsman, had written to me and says, "What's your family requirement? Because they've got to find you a hotel. I'm your sponsor from Operation Wing." And I said, "I've got 3 boys. One is at boarding school, and 2 are at boarding school, and 1 will be joining me. So I just need a hotel, a couple of rooms were fine." And he wrote back and said, "There's no way I'm letting a fellow Scotsman go into a hotel. You're staying with me." I went home to my wife and I said, "I need to tell this chap, very kind of him, that I'm a West Indian, black, wear glasses, balding. He will not miss me coming off the aircraft." And he came back. And he came back and said, "It makes no difference. You're staying with us for 2 nights, and I'll find you. We can go and look around for accommodation in the meantime, whilst you wait for married quarters to come up." And that's one extreme by the name. The other problem I had with the name is when I retired from the Royal Air Force, the MOD has a section called Retired Officers Association, which is rather like a trades union. And they copy your CV and float it to prospective employers. And in my case, one of the employers mine was floated to was the International Correspondence School. And I had booked for an interview with Norwich County Council in the Education Department. And when this lady from ICS rang up and says, "I've seen your CV. Is it possible for you to come for an interview tomorrow?" And I says, "No, I can't, because I'm going to Norwich for another interview." She says, "Well, what happens then? We'd like first crack at you. So why don't you we're happy to pay your expenses if you could come the day before, stay overnight in London. We'll interview you first, and then you can carry on to Norwich." And I said to my wife, "Right, this sounds promising." From my CV. Of course, it didn't say you come from Jamaica or anything. It just says retired RAF officer.
Yeah.
Phone. I turned up Wes, and it's as though this lady has an operation seen a ghost. She wasn't a very good HR. She just couldn't hide it. And we chatted. She offered me a cup of coffee, and I'm still waiting. Because she was completely baffled, because obviously the name, she expected a white face. And when I turned up, it's as though she'd seen a ghost.
Yeah.
And I could interview her rather than she was interviewing me. At the end of 40 minutes, I still left, say goodbye. And she says, "I have to speak to my colleagues." And this was a job where I would be given shares in the company with my gratuity and everything. So it was really fairly substantial. And I came home, wrote back to her for my expenses and said, I hope the next experience you have, you'll be able to provide the coffee and make a laugh of it. But she simply went by the name.
Yeah.
And didn't appreciate that, you know. So those are sort of personal experiences of where the privilege background, you're deemed not to be the person you are because you can't be for some reason or other, you know what I mean? So those things as an RAF officer, the only thing was missing from that CV was he's black.
Yeah.
That would have solved the problem because probably I wouldn't have been called forward for an interview. So we, unless you experience, it's very difficult really unless you experience these things. Yeah. And I think what we want generally is for white colleagues who appreciate some of these things to actually be part of our conversation. And this Black Lives Matters is fine, but why I'm pleased and delighted about it on this occasion with Floyd's death is that the diversity of people who have now saying we need to do something about this. But this has been going on for some time, one way or another. And much, as you probably appreciate, I've been involved in loads of organizations simply to see if I can get in, have some influence, or make a difference and educate. So I think the bottom line is education, really, because there's a lot of ignorance sometimes. It's not really racism as such, as people are completely ignorant of the facts.
And I think that's a really good point and very enlightening stories as well, Sydney. And I think that just brings me, we're really going to look at the last 5 minutes or so now of the conversation. I'd just like to ask each panel member really where do we start with, you know, we're talking about a big topic, some absolutely crucial issues, and I think sometimes it can seem a bit overwhelming. You know, I think particularly for some community organisations or voluntary organisations, they say, yes, we want to do something, but where do we start? So I'd just like each panel member maybe just to give one thing that everyone can take away and say, yes, I can do that, I can commit to that. Caroline, could we start with you?
Absolutely. So I think just in recognition that we were sent a couple of questions that people had sent in, and actually one of them had a quote in there from Thomas Sowell, and which made me kind of do a bit of research on him and also just understand kind of where he was standing on something. And I have to say I don't necessarily agree with a number of the things that he was suggesting, but there was a really interesting quote that he made, which was an American economist. He said the beauty of doing nothing is that you can do it perfectly, and only when you do something is it almost impossible to do it without mistakes. And I kind of thought, actually, that's it. I think there's this real acceptance now that doing nothing and accepting it's just actually that's the way it is, or in fact that doesn't touch my life. I think it was no longer there. We've all got to stand up and do something, and in either on a micro or a macro level, whatever we feel is within our gift. Ask more questions, you know, be more challenging in a constructive way, and be curious. I think as leaders in the third sector, often we're asked to work with communities, we're asked to support communities, we're asked to do address needs in the community in a whole different way, and often what was really needed is that we're leaders in our community, and sometimes our communities behave badly. And that's what I've taken away from all of this over the last 6 months, is that actually if I can help some of our communities and also me and my team understand more, then that's what we're going to do.
That's great, Caroline. And that was a great quote, actually. I thought, there's sometimes the idea that we have to get everything right straight away. But actually, I think sticking your head above the parapet and doing something, it isn't necessarily going to be done perfectly. But I think you're absolutely right. Iggy, have you got any comments, please?
Yeah, just a couple of things. One is obviously, as Caroline has said, we need to personally, I think, look internally, educate ourselves, and that's a constant responsibility. We shouldn't stand up and pretend that we know everything. Perfect example of this, the fiasco that was reported in the press about the proms and the lack of using the appropriate words, etc. If you actually look behind that story, you actually realize it has nothing to do with race. The first thing was a decision was made because there aren't going to be people there anyway. It's a COVID related matter. Secondly, once you start looking into these songs, you start looking into where the wording came from, you start to realize that some of the people that might be jumping on it from a race point of view are missing the point, because the song's intention was based on wars we were having, or the British Navy was having with the French and the Spanish at the time. And the other thing, once you start looking into it, is how many times those words have been changed over various periods of time for various reasons. And some of it has been because things have moved on. The song was, I think, was the late the 1700s when the song was first written. And I think that gives a perfect example of, even for me, who puts themselves up as somebody who might, who values equality, who feels that they value equality. I don't know everything, and that we must always start with our own assumptions. Have we got the facts right? I was told when I was working in equality diversity in a quite full meeting about equality and diversity management, but one of the words I'd used was quite racist. Obviously, I was horrified at this fact. I did some research on it, and I found that fact to be completely untrue. There was no founding behind it. It was just a perception. And again, it's all about education. We should take the time. Don't jump on the bandwagon and say, oh, I disagree with this. This is all wrong. Think about what it's been saying. Think about where it comes from. Think about what the purpose is. All these things matter. And once you get a better understanding, you can actually share that information and knowledge. And the majority of time, a lot of people go, actually, I did not know that. And they do tend to change their views because they think, well, it's not what it's implying. I think what's been mentioned before about the press, and I think the press, really, really need to try and portray a much more balanced picture. I think sometimes because controversy sells, I think, and they get people worked up behind it. And I think it's really important that everybody looks at themselves and starts with themselves, to say, I don't know everything. I may make mistakes, but it's okay. I'm human, that's allowed. And therefore, do not be afraid. And the important thing what I want to say about these courageous conversations is this is exactly the sort of thing that gives everybody the opportunity to say and speak and ask questions which they might not normally have done. And it's only through these sort of things that we can actually get and improve things and make things better.
Thanks, Iggy. That's great and speaks very powerfully to this topic. Lizzie.
So coming from the viewpoint of being in the third sector and what do we as third sector organisations proactively do and actually action here, I think we have to be very clear that not being racist is not enough. We as a community, as individuals, need to be anti-racist and taking up that extra step. So yes, our organisation Think to Speak is all about creating safe spaces to have conversations happen. That being said, we also have zero tolerance attitudes to racist language, to homophobic language, to transphobic language, and that is not for discussion, that is not for debate. We will not accept racist language being used. And that racist language I see as being like a fire, and a fire needs oxygen, it needs fuel. And actually, by having zero tolerance and stamping that out, you make a very strong point for how your organisation eats, sleeps and breathes, and also what is acceptable. So in our sessions and in the spaces that we create, we have zero tolerance, and we are very firm about that. We enable and activate conversations, but they do not tolerate racist language, and that's clear in all our policies, procedures, all of our training, and that comes from the top of our organisation all the way through, and everybody that gets involved with us agrees to respect and work in that way. So that's my first thing, is that actually making your organisation anti-racist, not just that you are you know, putting a black square on your Instagram feed for the day or whatever. You're actually doing the work to listen, to learn, to watch and to embed change. The second thing is maybe a little bit glib, but I would ask everybody to watch the film 13th. So it's on Netflix, and it looks at the history through activist advocates and academics of Black history in America, and the whole prisons and everything over there. Very, very powerful way of getting up to speed, learning a heck of a lot, and I think it's a really good starting place for some really good conversation. So I would encourage people, particularly if you've got teams, ask everyone to watch it, and then get a session going where you can all talk about what you've learned from it, what you've taken from it, and what you could think about going forwards.
Great, thanks, Lizzie. And Sydney, just very briefly, because time isn't on our side now, I'm afraid. What can we take away as individuals and as third sector organisations?
Well, education is a key, and I think both of the previous speakers, part of my panel members, touched on it. That is the actual key, because the first thing that struck me when I arrived in the UK, you know, I've had to teach my three lads, is that the curriculum in Jamaica, for example, which was under the British education system until the 1944 Education Act, we had as part of British history the slave trade, and the old what surprised me when I came to the UK is that it was not in the British curriculum. We should have made such a difference in people being more informed, because I think you need to. I hate this political correctness thing, because I think you need all sides of the issues and all sides of the stories, and without background information of why that thing was said, because with hate messages, until you experience it, you don't really realize it, and it can be quite hurtful. But if people are educated enough, they probably wouldn't use it, especially people in high places who are influencing loads of other people. So I think the bottom line for me is education. I think Mandela says education is the most powerful weapon we can use to change the world, and I believe in that. The more informed we are. So there's simple things, like, for example, I was just reflecting on today with one of my lads. I'm a member of the International Burma Command Trust as a trustee, and not many people, even people living in Lincolnshire, appreciate that a fifth of West Indian pilots and that were actually located in Burma Command in the county. We talk about generally, but they don't highlight those. So you think of Burma Command and you think, yes, we know we had Commonwealth people, but did we have any black faces? Because most of the stuff you read, you very seldom see them. So that sort of thing. So we need complete picture, really. And the bottom line is education.
Thank you very much, Sydney. And I'd like to thank all the panel members, Sydney, Lizzie, Iggy, Caroline, for taking part today. That's been and bearing with us through the technical maelstrom. Yeah. But I think it's gone well. Thank you to everyone who has attended. I'm aware that we've not been able to respond to every comment or every question. I hope that you're all able to take something away from this. But what we will aim to do is to respond post-event to some of those questions and the points that have been raised. I'll make sure that the panel members have got that information. And
if I could just chip in to give you some information which might be helpful, especially to voluntary organisations.
Yeah.
The University of Lincoln is doing an academic study into migrants' contribution to the UK. I've got a complete chapter in it. 2 years in civilian life and then 30 years in the RAF, and what hurdles and problems I met throughout the way. It's at the publishers at the moment. So if you let me know once it's published, we can organise, because it'll make good reading, not just for my chapter, but obviously it'll give a complete picture generally.
That would be brilliant, Sydney. Thank you for that, and we'll make sure that yeah, that's probably another online conversation when the book comes out.
Yes,
and
indeed.
yeah, that would be great. But thank you everyone for coming. I hope you're able to attend some of the future conversations. You'll be able to find that information on the Just Lincolnshire website. Thank you very much, and I hope you can take some actions away with you. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you
Wes.
very much indeed.
Thanks, Wes.
Thank you.